Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here for LNG Unpacked Climate and Health Implications. This is the third webinar in our four-part series focused on LNG, where we have been hoping to educate folks around the risks of LNG, what the environmental impacts will be to us, what the health impacts are, affordability impacts, etc. And we are very happy that you have joined us here this evening. I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. Can we go to the next slide, Murray? Thank you. All right, so I am sure that most folks joining this call tonight are probably tuning in from so-called British Columbia. I'm actually, I'm traveling right now, so I'm on the territories of the Mohican and Lenape peoples, which is also known colonially as New York. But I wanted to, in today's land acknowledgement, I wanted to really reference yesterday, which hopefully folks know was the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And yes, that is recognized nationally one day of the year, but of course, we should be always thinking about Indigenous sovereignty and justice and land back every day of the year. I wanted to particularly showcase a few resources and organizations and groups that are really doing amazing work. For example, what you see on the screen, these images are from the Lakia Firekeepers. They are a group of youth, mostly based on Gitxsan territory out in northern BC. They are doing fantastic work. They are on the front lines doing land defense. And I just wanted to share their Instagram account here in case folks haven't heard of them. They are doing such good work and they're very inspirational and courageous, and they're fighting a number of fossil fuel infrastructure projects on their territories right now. Please check them out if you haven't already. And I also wanted to bring up a film, which is absolutely phenomenal, called Yinta, which focuses on the Wet'suwet'en fight against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. That film was made over the span of 10 years. You can find it on Netflix and CBC Gem. And finally, I wanted to share a resource which was just published a few days ago by the amazing Janelle Lapointe. She published an article in the Walrus called "Indigenous Priorities Are Just a Checkbox When It Comes to Economic Development." And so to acknowledge the land, I thought it was important to just share these really incredible resources with folks if you weren't aware of them, so that we can continue as settlers to be acknowledging our own positionality, continuing to be learning, etc., and standing in solidarity with Indigenous folks, particularly with Indigenous land defenders who are really on the front lines. So for tonight's session, it's going to start off with an overview of LNG. What is it? Why is it harmful? After that, I will pass it on to our fantastic speakers that we have joining us today. After they speak, I will walk us through a few next steps if you're feeling really inspired and you want to find ways to get more involved with fighting LNG or learning more. And we'll end with some closing thoughts. So we are aiming to get everybody out of here within 1 hour. If you're listening to the speakers and you have any questions, we do encourage you to put those into the chat and we will try our hardest to get to them. And I think without, let's see, you can go to the next slide there, Mari. Yes, okay. I would like to introduce our speakers for tonight. I should probably introduce myself too. My name is Emiko Newman. I'm the coordinator of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign. We are the ones who are hosting this four-part webinar series If you haven't heard of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign, we are a coalition of organizations that are concerned about the climate crisis, who have all come together to form this group, the BC Climate Emergency Campaign, to push the BC government to take more urgent climate action. And we are so excited to be partnering on this particular webinar tonight with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment. And so we're really lucky to have Dr. Bethany Ricker with us from CAPE, Zachary Daly from Kane, and Dr. Rachel Grimminck from CAPE. And I will introduce each of them right before they speak. But first of all, we're going to get into the overview about LNG. And I'm sure folks have varying levels of knowledge around what LNG is. Some of this may be old news, some of it might be new. So let's dive in. Why are we hosting these sessions right now? This is a really pivotal moment in BC's history, but Canada's history as well as a country, because we just started a few months ago exporting LNG abroad for the first time. Before this, Canada had never exported our LNG, and this has implications for everybody who lives in this country, but particularly folks in so-called British Columbia. The first LNG that was exported from Kitimat, from a place called LNG Canada, which is the export terminal. In addition to that, we recently saw another pipeline approved. This was the PRGT, or Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Pipeline. That project was approved despite vigorous Indigenous opposition and opposition from a number of organizations and groups and individuals. And the BC government decided to push that project through anyways. What's next? Well, the list goes on. Silism's LNG is another terminal that was just approved a few weeks ago. Again, despite a lot of opposition. Woodfibre LNG is a project in Squamish that is also under construction. Cedar LNG is a project in Kitimat, also under construction. LNG Canada Phase 2 was just added to Prime Minister Mark Carney's list of nationally significant projects. There were 5 projects on that list, and this was one of them. Tilbury LNG is yet another project that we are still waiting to hear if it will be approved. So as you can see from this list, it's quite extensive. BC is really caught up in this frenzy of LNG expansion. And the problem is that they continue to push this onto the public as something that is positive, that's good news for the economy and for jobs, etc. And so we wanted to host this series to try to counter that messaging, and so that folks know this is not a good thing for British Columbians or for the country at large or for the climate. All right, so let's just back up for a second and talk about what even is LNG. What are we talking about here? LNG stands for liquefied natural gas, but there's nothing good about natural gas. Natural gas is primarily methane, and methane is a fossil fuel that is actually far more potent and harmful for the environment than carbon dioxide. Over a 10-year span, it traps 105 times more heat than carbon dioxide. And usually when you hear people talking about emissions, you hear CO2, but methane is far, far worse for the climate. So natural gas, this term natural gas, is really one of the best examples of greenwashing out there. They did a really good job of making it sound like this is something that's good, something that we should be using. But in reality, you might hear folks call it fracked gas or methane gas, which honestly, more people should start doing, because that actually says it like it is, and moves away from the greenwashing of saying natural gas. So some people call natural gas fracked gas because that's what it is. Natural gas is obtained through a process called hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking. Fracking is an incredibly destructive process. Essentially, they take sand and water and chemicals and they inject this mixture deep underground at very high pressure so that it splits or it fractures the rock. The gas then comes out and it is captured. This process uses billions of liters of fresh water every single year. And the problem is that that water then gets poisoned and becomes so toxic because of all those chemicals that it cannot be re-entered into the water cycle. So once fresh water is taken from local rivers and local streams and is used for fracking, it has to be then stored in special tailings ponds, and it has to be kept covered because if a bird lands on the water, if animals drink from the water, they will die. That's how toxic this water is. Keep in mind, fracking companies are paying next to nothing to use this water. Meanwhile, many parts of BC have been in a drought for a long time, and people are being told to take shorter showers. So I don't know how that makes any sense. Fracking also leads to earthquakes. It's that violent of a process. In 2024 alone, there's an area called the Montney Formation, which recorded 34 earthquakes, which were just caused by fracking alone. Now, I want to do some myth busting here. So some of you may have heard before that natural gas is cleaner than coal. And so therefore, it's an important transition fuel to get other countries off of coal. And I want to bust this myth. So first of all, the idea that natural gas is cleaner than coal, I'd like to show you a chart. If we look at the process of burning coal and burning gas, only the process of burning these materials, then it's true. Gas does burn cleaner than coal, but this is only one piece of a much larger picture. If we zoom out and we look at the entire life cycle, we have to consider the upstream emissions, and upstream emissions are the emissions that are released before something gets burnt. So when we take natural gas, it has to be fracked, it has to be processed and liquefied, then it gets transported on ships, often across long distances. On the other side, it then has to be regasified and eventually burned. And when we take into account that entire process from start to finish, methane is leaking all the way along. Methane, we know, is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so once you consider that entire life cycle, you can see natural gas is in fact far worse for the climate than coal is. Coal is just a chunk of rock that sits there on a train. Nothing is being emitted from it before it gets burned. Natural gas is a different story altogether. The second part of that myth was that, well, okay, fine, maybe it's not great for the climate, but at least it's displacing coal overseas. This is also not the case. And we have seen experts conducting research and being very clear that natural gas is not displacing coal in China or in India. And we don't have too much time to get into all the reasonings behind that and the explanations, but we will put a podcast episode that we recorded with an expert on the subject, Clark Williams Daly. He's with the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis. We'll put that into the chat, and we do encourage you to take a look at that, take a listen. Thanks, Mari, because he goes into more detail about exactly why it's the case that coal is not being displaced overseas. This is something I'm sure people on this call have heard about, because that's a talking point that the government loves to throw around, that China needs our help and India needs our help. And this is not actually the case. Typically on these webinars, I have been talking about health impacts as well, but of course we have 3 health experts with us tonight. So I'm skipping ahead to talk about some affordability impacts caused by LNG exporting. I think everybody knows that that within BC, affordability is a key concern for so many people. And the problem is gas prices are going up. If you are a FortisBC customer, you may have noticed back in February, you saw a hike in your gas bills. This is to pay for pipelines. And what we have seen is that in other countries, for example, the US, Australia, when they started exporting LNG, their domestic gas prices rose. In the case of Australia, their gas prices locally tripled. And, you know, to be clear, those are different countries, very different contexts, but it does seem likely, given that this is becoming a pattern, that now that Canada has started exporting our natural gas, that we are going to see even more price increases to our gas and electricity bills. Even the BC budget put out by the BC government predicted that natural gas or fracked gas will be going up 113% this year. That's the BC government putting that out in their own communications. And so, you know, you might hear like, okay, LNG might not be great for the climate, might not be great for for our health, but at least, you know, jobs and the economy and affordability, it's going to make a difference. And that is not the case. You can keep going, Mari. So economically, we can see that the business case for LNG exporting is quickly weakening. By the end of this decade, projections are showing that we're going to have an oversupplied global LNG market. We're going to be having way more LNG supply than demand. The other thing to know here is that BC is really late to the game. We're trying to run along behind all these countries and be like, we want to export our LNG too. We want to be part of this. But Russia, the US, Qatar, and a number of other countries have been exporting their natural gas for years now, and they can do it much more cheaply than Canada is able to, meaning we're entering the market, which is volatile and risky, at a time when it's honestly not needed. It's really unnecessary for us to be doing this. We're seeing with more forecasts, natural gas demand is going down. At the same time, global renewable energy generation capacity is going up. Economically, it makes no sense for us to be trying to enter this global market right now. And so that does leave us with the risk of stranded assets. This might look like putting LNG infrastructure in place that is either finalized or maybe it's half built. If it gets stranded, it then gets abandoned. You know, if the government realizes or if investors realize this is actually not something that we can pursue, taxpayers are going to be on the hook. It's really not a good idea. The final thing that I'll discuss before passing it on to our other speakers is the MAGA connections. And this might be something that folks are a bit less well acquainted with, and that a number of groups, including ours, including Dogwood and others, are really trying to make known, because this is really important. LNG in BC is being advanced by American investors. Not only are they American, many of them are actually closely allied with the Trump administration. So let me give you a specific example. The Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline was approved in June, as I mentioned at the beginning. This pipeline is 50% owned by Texas-based Western LNG. You can keep going, Mari. Thanks. One of Western LNG's main investors is a private equity firm called Blackstone Inc. Blackstone's CEO is a man named Steve Schwarzman. Here he is. Steve donated more than $39 million to the 2024 presidential race in support of Trump's agenda. He's actually one of Trump's top 10 donors. The Salisbury LNG terminal, which I also mentioned, that was just approved a few weeks ago, is 100% American owned. The BC government likes to say that it's Indigenous owned. It's not. It's American owned. Not only is it American owned, as you can see, these projects have close ties to MAGA billionaires. MAGA billionaires are not the ones who should be profiting. This is a time when we are seeing our politicians telling us that they are elbows up, that we need to be distancing ourselves from the American economy. By approving these projects and pushing them through unceded Indigenous territories, not only are they going against UNDRIP and DRIPA commitments, not only are they poisoning our water and the land and causing severe health impacts, they are also directly lining the pockets of these MAGA billionaires. Does this sound like a good idea to you? I hope not. And this is why it's so important for us to be spreading the word that this is what LNG expansion means. This is what this is what exporting our LNG is going to lead to. So I hope from this very quick overview, you have a clearer sense of why we need to be moving away from natural gas and from LNG exports and towards cleaner, more affordable, renewable energy sources. I will leave it there, and I am now so happy to pass it on to our speakers. So we are first going to hear from Dr. Bethany Ricker. Dr. Ricker is a family doctor who lives and works on the lands of the Snuneymuxw people, also known as Nanaimo. She's the co-chair of CAPE BC, CAPE being the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and she also sits on the board of the Nanaimo Climate Action Hub. In her free time, she loves biking, hiking, and skiing, all sorts of outdoorsy stuff. Dr. Ricker, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for setting the stage there, Emiko. Okay, just to make sure, can everyone see my slides clearly there? Just the slide screen. Awesome. Okay, thanks for setting us up with a good background, Emiko. So I'll just start sharing a few anecdotes. Last month, KBC launched our annual awareness campaign about the health harms of LNG. And we gathered a delegation of CAPE and CANE healthcare professionals, as well as healthcare professionals from northern BC in the heart of the sacrifice zone of fracking and pipeline development, and Indigenous leaders from the Gittineau, Gitxsan, and Wet'suwet'en territories. And some of the stories they shared were jaw-dropping. A family doctor from Dawson Creek shared how there were multiple glioblastoma brain cancers diagnosed in their small community over only a few short years, and shared how her radiologist colleague was appalled as he hadn't seen that many cases of this aggressive, fatal brain cancer in his previous decades of career working elsewhere. Some of the phenomenal young Indigenous women of the Latgip Firekeepers organization that Emiko spoke about were also present, sharing many of their concerns, including concerns as Indigenous women living in a high-risk area along the Highway of Tears, where the new PRGT pipeline will bring man camps within just a few kilometers of where they live. And Chief Namox of the Wet'suwet'en, pictured here, spoke about a community where every kindergartner is prophylactically prescribed an inhaler because the astronomically high rates of childhood asthma would mean that almost all of them would need an inhaler at some point soon anyways. And these stories are just the tip of the iceberg as far as LNG's effects on health. As Emiko outlined, there are multiple steps in the extraction, transportation, processing, and use of LNG, and each of them comes with their own health risks, only some of which we'll get a chance to review today. So I'll start by discussing two types of pollution from the LNG industry, which both have their own health harms. The fracking process, which Emiko spoke about, is primarily where ground and water contamination occurs. That water, sand, and toxic chemical mix that you spoke about are injected into these deep wells under high pressure and then returned back to the surface as flowback, containing both the injected chemicals plus naturally occurring toxic materials. Over 1,000 different chemicals are used in this process, and some of them are known or suspected carcinogens, so causing cancer, as well as known to negatively affect reproduction, child development, or disrupt hormones. There are well-documented cases of contamination of surface and groundwater that contaminates drinking water, and exposure to that water is linked with gastrointestinal problems, hormone disruption, and reproductive disorders. In Dawson Creek in northeastern BC, physicians were seeing such frequent health conditions that were linked potentially to contaminated drinking water that they started installing reverse osmosis water filters in their own homes. And then there's air pollutants, which can be emitted from several sources at a fracking site and along the path of LNG production. It is emitted from open fracking fluid ponds, from diesel equipment used at fracking sites, from the methane gas leakage at every point in the LNG production process, from flaring, which is pictured here, the process of controlled burning of methane. This is in Kitimat. As well as when we use gas in our homes for heating and cooking. Some of these air pollutants include benzene, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen oxides, particulate matters, methane, other hydrocarbons, and more. And all of these have known adverse health effects. So I'll speak a bit about the health harms primarily around fracking sites. The type of health impact most studied to date is the effects on pregnant patients and infants. Living near fracking sites increases the risks of complications of pregnancy, such as high blood pressure and eclampsia, which is a dangerous condition where one can have seizures in pregnancy. It increases adverse pregnancy outcomes, including miscarriages, preterm birth, birth defects, low birth weight, and all of these have long-lasting effects potentially on these children. Low birth weight and preterm birth are associated with health conditions later in life, such as adverse cardiovascular, metabolic, neurodevelopmental, and respiratory conditions. And it is overall, living near a fracking site is overall linked with increased rates of fetal and infant deaths. There have been biomonitoring studies in British Columbia, which have reported higher levels of benzene, which is a known cancer-causing agent, in the urine of pregnant women, and also found multiple other trace toxicants and increased particulate air pollutants in the air in homes of pregnant women living close to fracking activity. Living near fracking sites is associated with increased rates of asthma, increased inhaler prescriptions, and increased hospitalizations and emergency departments linked to asthma. It's also associated with increased rates of pneumonia hospitalizations and overall more adverse respiratory symptoms. And outside of the context of just living near fracking, when we use gas in our homes, it also has adverse respiratory effects. Children who live in homes with gas stoves face a 42% higher risk of developing asthma compared to kids living in homes without gas stoves, which is similar to the risk of living with a smoker. Living near fracking sites is associated with higher rates of some types of cancer. There are more than 50 carcinogens released into the air and water by fracking activities. Children living near fracking sites have 2 to 3 times higher risk of ALL, blood cancer, and there's possible risks with prostate cancer, bladder cancer, childhood brain cancer, and lung cancer. Living near fracking sites increases heart failure hospitalization rates, increases heart attack and stroke rates, and deaths from strokes. And in studies of symptoms experienced by people living near fracking sites, other reported symptoms are migraines, sinusitis, and skin conditions. Overall, people who live near fracking sites die sooner. There's just an overall higher rate of premature death, as well as higher rates of hospitalization for respiratory, cancer-related, cardiovascular, neurologic, and other reasons. And there's still a lot we don't know. We don't have adequate data on more than 1,000 of the identified chemicals used in fracking. Some chemicals are not publicized for proprietary reasons. And very concerningly, we have minimal Canadian data. In a scoping review published in March 2024 with the specific stated goal of focusing on Canadian studies, only 2 out of the 52 studies that met inclusion criteria were Canadian. This evidence of absence is concerning given our almost 20-year fracking history and, as Emiko outlined, our continued active expansion currently, as well as concerning because a lot of these activities take place on the territories of Indigenous communities who are already disproportionately impacted by health and economic disparities, which are worsened by the LNG industry. We also need further data on the cumulative effects, so living near multiple fracking sites or being exposed to other local health-harming exposures and effects over time, as well as the effects of sites that are abandoned and no longer used. I don't have enough time to get into a lot of the other aspects of less direct health harms related to LNG and activity, which fortunately some of our other speakers will be able to review. But one further thing I'll quickly add is that there's also disruption to the healthcare system. Almost half of the doctors in Dawson Creek relocated in recent years, citing the health and community impacts of fracking as one of their primary reasons to leave. And there are many other somewhat less direct health effects, but I will leave it there so our other speakers have a chance to review some of those.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Ricker. I say awesome because that was a great presentation, but that was very distressing and depressing information that you shared. And I think in particular, one of the scariest things is just how little research that there has been done, as you mentioned, particularly in Canada, particularly considering BC is now this going to be a mega exporter of natural gas, way more fracking happening than we have ever seen before. And it's pretty terrifying, particularly for those communities where the fracking sites will be located. They don't know what's going to happen to them and their families. And one of your first slides had a picture of the flaring. That is happening right now. LNG Canada is flaring in Kitimat, and people who live nearby are seeing it from their bedroom windows, from their kitchen windows. They don't know what chemicals are leaching into the air that they're then breathing in, that their children are breathing in. And nobody is telling them. Industry is not going to tell them. The government is not going to tell them. And that is, extremely concerning. There is an article that was really well done in the Tyee, which I just put into the chat there, that I would encourage folks to read through, which after listening to our speakers will already know much of what is included in that article. I am going to pass on to our next speaker, who is Zachary Daly. Zachary is a registered nurse with a background in child and adolescent mental health. He is the BC co-representative for CANE and is currently also completing a PhD in nursing. His research focuses on how climate change impacts youth mental health. And Zach, we are so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to attempt to share my slides. It's always exciting on Zoom. So just give me one moment. Hopefully there should be some slides there. Great. Yes, my name is Zachary Daly, he, him. I'm a registered nurse, and I'm going to be talking about climate change and health generally. So the previous speaker did a great job, I thought, talking about kind of health impacts of LNG specifically, but our first speaker, Emiko, also talked about sort of how LNG is this potent greenhouse gas and has all these climate change implications. And so we're going to zoom out a bit and talk about just general health implications of climate change. Part of why I think this is important is Lots of folks think about climate change as an environmental issue, and it absolutely is, but it also is a health issue. And in fact, I think sometimes thinking of it through the health lens can be really helpful for getting people to listen and hear and get on board with some of this messaging, because we all have health. We all have health concerns ourselves, or health concerns of family members. So I do think health is a really powerful message. But before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge that I work on and I'm presenting from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam. So there's already an introduction, so this slide is superfluous, so thank you. I mean, the one thing I'll just add to is a lot of my work is informed by the fact that I'm also a parent. I've got 2 small kids, and so I do think quite a lot about the world that they're growing up in, what it'll be like, which is not to say that gives me a special or privileged position. I don't claim that, but it certainly impacts my work and how I approach it. And just related to that, I will have to step out a bit early tonight just to help with some times. So thank you so much. So what we're going to talk about. So there'll be a high-level description of how climate change harms health. High level because unfortunately there are many ways which climate change harms health. And so if we were to really go into depth, we'd be here for hours or maybe taking a multi-week long course all about it. There's quite a few impacts. I'm going to bring up some equity considerations around those health impacts. I know some of that's already been touched on, but I want to reiterate that. I can do a quick dive into 2 specific things around extreme heat and wildfires. I think a lot of folks are probably from BC in this audience, so that might be really salient or relevant. So I think it's helpful to focus on that. And then I'm going to end with some thoughts on the role of healthcare professionals, as I suspect there might be a number in the audience listening tonight. And then we'll have another speaker to talk more about mental health. So I'm not going to focus on mental health here because there's another speaker focusing on that. So this is an image from the World Health Organization, and this is on health outcomes related to climate change. So up top, you can see there's climate change, and then that can lead to, climate-related hazards, extreme weather events, heat, sea level rise, air pollution, water scarcity, reduced food production, and then there's exposures and vulnerability factors, and all these kind of mesh together to result into various health outcomes. So some of the ones that they identify are injury. So of course, if there's an extreme weather event, people can get injured or even die during the event. If you think of a flood or a wildfire, there's heat-related illness. So we'll focus on that a bit. I think that's on a lot of people's minds, given some of the history in British Columbia. Respiratory illness, I think smoke. So we'll talk about that one a bit. There's also quite a lot of impacts around diseases. So waterborne diseases, the transmission of diseases between animals and humans, as well as vector-borne diseases. So as the climate changes, disease patterns and transmission patterns are shifting. And depending on where in the world, there's different diseases that have been identified as kind of becoming problematic in different ways because of climate change. For instance, the range of certain mosquitoes is changing. The ranges of other illness-carrying organisms is also changing and putting humans into more close contact with them. There's also malnutrition. And so if you think about the impact that climate change can have on food production systems, that'll cause malnutrition. There's also impacts on non-communicable diseases. Another thing that's not really here too, if you think about really downstream of climate change, there's some people looking at the role that climate change can have in sort of destabilizing certain societies and leading longer term to conflict, things like that. So all of that would have health implications. Another thing that I like, which is sort of odd to say with this topic, but I like about this slide is it also highlights health system impacts, health system facilities. And so I'll talk a bit about that, but climate change, as has already been demonstrated, or previously with LNG, can have impacts to our health system. And so then once again, any damage to our health system will then negatively impact the health of our populations, which is especially prevalent. There's all this rhetoric in the media around certain strains that our health system is under. And so this is just another strain to that system. But as I said, I wanted to touch a bit about equity, as well as pointing to some resources. And so you'll see there's an image in the lower left, front page of report, Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate. This is a really excellent document. It's a couple years old now, but really good information. It is essentially textbook in length, but there's good executive summaries and short bits if you don't have time to read a whole textbook. And it really goes into in really good detail how climate change is impacting health with a Canadian focus. What is known, what is not known, what are the impacts, and they have a whole chapter essentially looking at equity considerations. And so there's this quote from the report, which is just changes in climate are exacerbating existing health inequities and creating conditions for new inequities to emerge. the health effects associated with climate change will not be experienced uniformly. Another way to think about this is a lot of people talk about climate change as a risk multiplier. Whatever inequities already exist within a society, climate change comes in and just ramps them up. And so we can think about inequities due to socioeconomic status, structural racism, ongoing impacts of colonialism. Climate change interacts with these, and so then causes those impacts to be felt disproportionately. And so folks that are already experiencing health inequities will experience more and greater health inequities. And so this is just an image from the report, and they go into more detail, really talking about some of the pathways through which this can happen. One way you can think about too is you can think about, so some groups might be more exposed to certain impacts based on where they are living for all sorts of structural historical reasons. You can also think about the ability of certain communities to cope with these things, so their adaptive capacity. And this has nothing to do with any inherent characteristics of the communities, obviously. Rather, thinking about structural issues that cause certain communities to have less resources, and then because of that, they're less able to adapt to any of these changes that are going on. And so, once again, I think in any discussion of climate change and health or climate change generally, I think it's really important to bring this equity piece into it. I do want to focus a bit on extreme heat. And so I have another report cover here. It's rather simple one. So this is the report from the coroner's report around the extreme heat dome that hit British Columbia and actually all the Pacific Northwest in the summer of 2021. And so this is a report. I will say it's heavy reading, but it really goes into sort of what happened, what were the impacts of this event, the heat dome that hit in 2021. Generally speaking, though, if we think of extreme heat, as per the BC CDC, extreme heat events are associated with heat-related illnesses such as heat stroke, dehydration, heat exhaustion. They can also worsen existing conditions. They can lead to mortality. And so in the specific case of that awful event, I mean, it's seared in my memory, they found, the BC Coroner's report, that the heat dome is associated with 619 deaths across British Columbia. And then if we think once again of that equity piece, when they looked at who are these folks that died, it was mostly older adults, those who lived alone, and those who already had compromised health. So once again, there's this equity consideration. We're all impacted, but some folks are impacted more than others. Another thing they talk about is the health system impacts of this. And so during the peak of the event, they talk about this report, 911 calls actually doubled. A lot of people in a lot of distress. And then what's also talked about too is in some cases, people are having to wait a very long time, or certainly longer than people would ever want to get help. I know the next speaker is going to focus on mental health, but even that has mental health implications for the call providers. And like it was awful for the health system, the folks working in that system really struggling to, they want to provide good care, and it feels awful when you're not able to provide that care. A separate study found an increase in overall emergency department visits during that extreme heat event. So once again, thinking of health system implications, just way more people showing up in the ER. And that increase in ER visits persisted for a full week after sort of the peak of the event. So there was sort of that tail. One thing they also found, it was not just that more people were showing up, it's that more people who were showing up who were already critically ill at the time of showing up. And so once again, thinking of extreme heat, sort of health impacts. The other one I want to talk about is wildfires. And so there's an image there. And so, wildfire smoke contains numerous harmful substances. There's quite a few of them. One you might hear of a lot is, this particulate matter PM 2.5. And you might wonder, so what are they actually talking about? So this is an image that shows just how small it is. So they have, beach sand, and then they have a grain of sand, and then they show, okay, PM 10, so that's a bit bigger, and they say, okay, well, that's certainly much smaller than a human hair. That's pretty small. And then they show, okay, even compared to that, this is the size PM 2.5. So it is really, really small. And this is a problem because PM 2.5 is a concern because it's been shown to be able to cross several of the barriers in the human body. So the human body, there's all these wonderful, really important barriers that the human body has to help keep things out that shouldn't be getting to places that they should get. So for instance, PM 2.5, there's now evidence that it can cross even the blood-brain barrier, that it can enter into our bloodstream, it's inhaled deeply into the lungs, and so it can end up kind of in a number of parts of our body. And then because of this, there's all sorts of research looking at, and this is an evolving field, but PM 2.5 exposure and cardiovascular impacts, respiratory impacts, as well as even nervous system impacts because it can cross the blood-brain barrier. And so this is an air concern. This is why you often see people talking about when there's wildfire smoke and they're talking about that PM 2.5 is because it is really quite harmful. A recent study, so they looked at wildfire smoke and exposure to PM 2.5 from Canadian wildfires in 2023. And what's interesting is they looked at the impacts not just in Canada, but so remember, climate change impacts the whole world. Wildfire smoke does not obey any particular geographic boundaries. And so they found that because of that smoke in 2023 is associated with 5,400 more additional acute deaths in North America, as well as over 64,000 sort of chronic deaths in North America and in Europe due to the fires, the smoke in Canada. And so once again, that's quite alarming to me. And then also there's health system implications. And so when there's wildfire smoke, you see increased ER presentations, largely due to asthma. There's other potential pathways being studied, but asthma seems to be the big one, which makes sense. If there's really bad smoke, more people are showing up all of a sudden to the ER with asthma exacerbations. Another health system impact is impact of hospitals and long-term care facilities. They have to be evacuated. That is not good for anyone. And in some cases, damages to health facilities. And so there's this quote that I really like from a researcher. Says, the health harms of climate change are a concern and responsibility of all health professionals. Every practitioner has an opportunity and obligation to influence others around them to mitigate associated physical and mental health problems. And so this is just to come back to, and I realize I've gone over time, so I apologize. Climate change is a health issue. And this is why, for instance, the CNA has a position statement on planetary health. If there's any nurses in the room, I suggest you look at it. There's one there, but it says pretty unequivocally, the health and well-being of the planet that supports the thriving of life must be seen as a key determinant of health and therefore a top priority to nurses. And you'll also find, if there's other healthcare professionals, you can find relevant statements on climate change, planetary health from Canadian Medical Association, Canadian Association of Social Workers, Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists, and many, many more. So once again, thank you so much, and sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Zach. That was wonderful and very informative. And I'm sure a lot of people remember the 2021 heat dome. I definitely remember that very clearly. You do have to get off early to go help with bedtime. So go to your children. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Time to pass it over to our third and final speaker, who is Dr. Rachel Grimminck, who is a psychiatrist living on the unceded territories of the Cowichan peoples. She is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Calgary and at UBC, and is a certified group psychotherapist through the International Board for Certification of Group Psychotherapists. Dr. Grimminck also facilitates psychoeducational, mindfulness-based, and process-oriented groups, and is certified to teach mindfulness and nature meditation. She also has training in climate psychiatry, serves in leadership roles with Mindspace, is a board member of the BC Psychiatric Association, a member of CAPE, and a core member of a multi-year University of Calgary study addressing mental health stigma in healthcare. Oh, that was so many things and qualifications. Dr. Grimminck, I'm so excited to have you here. Over to you.
Thanks, Emiko. And yeah, thank you so much for putting on this event and having me here tonight. I will just share my slides here. I did just change the title from mental health and LNG to mental health and fracked gas based on your suggestion. So this will be a high level overview, and I'll just get started. And there are multiple known health and environmental hazards related to frack gas, and it impacts social welfare at all stages of its life cycle. And all of these have impacts on mental health. So we'll work our way through these. The first one is local hazards, and that includes environmental pollution, earthquakes, and community disruption. So this is a really excellent article that was published September 26th this year in the Narwhal, where they talk about the impacts of environmental pollution on the residents of Kitimat. So, and this we mentioned the flaring, and that in particular has been quite impactful for people. And there was a recent article by a CAPE member, Dr. Takero, who found that the amount of natural gas burned during the startup of an LNG export terminal is nearly 3 times higher than during regular operations. So it's likely contributing to what people in Kitimat are experiencing right now. And my co-presenters have talked about different aspects of air pollution, so I won't reiterate some of this, but I did want to just mention that there are also ultrafine particles, and when there's air pollution with heat, it's more a higher risk of creating these ultrafine particles that can cross the blood-brain barrier into the brain, in addition to the harm from larger particles. And so air pollution can lead to brain inflammation, and that can contribute to a variety of mental illnesses throughout the life course. So I'll go through a few of them. To really from basically the moment of conception through to late life. There's impacts including increased rates of autism, intellectual disability, ADHD, depression, suicide, anxiety, psychotic disorders, like schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease. So these are really life-altering illnesses. And nitrogen dioxide and benzene in particular increase the risk of schizophrenia. And we know that children are particularly vulnerable because they for a variety of physiological reasons. And Dr. Ricker also spoke to how vulnerable pregnant women are as well. And so the air pollution also leads to inflammation throughout the body and a variety of health conditions that Dr. Ricker has outlined. And this is important because it does influence mental illness throughout the life course as well. And we have a really artificial distinction between mental health and other domains of health, and they're really not separate. And individuals with any non-psychiatric medical condition are at higher risk of depression. And this is a reciprocal relationship. So anybody with depression is at higher risk of non-psychiatric medical conditions. And the water pollution that has been discussed can lead to water insecurity. This is a pond with some of the wastewater from a facility in northern British Columbia. And so, because the groundwater may be contaminated, these pollutants can also go into the air. That can contribute to water anxiety. There may be scarcity, there's lower quality of water, limited accessibility, and water insecurity has been linked to poor mental health. And with the flaring, that obviously creates a lot of light, and artificial light at night can disrupt circadian rhythms and decrease the quality of sleep for people of all ages. And it's also associated with increased prevalence of depressive symptoms and suicidal behaviors. And then there's the noise aspect. This is just 2 articles from this year, one in March, one in April, with residents having concerns about the level of noise generated from LNG facilities. And so noise is stressful. It can impact, it can lead to hearing loss. It can obviously impact sleep. And at lower levels of sound, it's annoying. We can't communicate with each other. It can impact sleep and lead to cognitive impairment. And so all of this is very stressful, and it leads to a variety of mental health consequences, anxiety, depression, more emotional dysregulation, which means more intense emotions, behavioral changes, and can contribute to reduced resiliency. And then, and this can understandably lead to maladaptive coping in various ways, including substance use or other forms of coping. And Emiko mentioned the earthquakes. There were a series of earthquakes in early 2025, and earthquakes can lead to injury, significant anxiety, and also loss of property value, which can further exacerbate the financial strain that many people are feeling right now. And there is understandably a robust negative relationship between earthquake intensity and mental well-being as well. Yeah, Dr. Ricker mentioned these industrial work camps that are sometimes called man camps because they tend to be quite male dominated. And they have been quite in a number of reports linked to increased gender-based violence, and Indigenous women and girls are at particular risk. There's also higher rates of substance use, and this can lead to significant social disruption to families and communities, which can further increase mental health presentations and strain already strained health services, and particularly mental health services. Some of the regional hazards include fires and explosions. And the picture on the left here is from an event in April of this year, where there's a fire and a possible explosion leading to a death and injury at an LNG plant. And then the picture on the right is from an explosion in 2018. And so these kinds of events will have lasting mental health impacts on survivors, including higher rates of PTSD. And then finally, on a global scale, the production of frack gas and the combustion of it contributes to climate change in a really significant way. And so what that means for mental health is, more frequent disasters, greater severity of disasters, storms, floods, landslides, wildfires that we've been experiencing. And these can all exacerbate existing mental health conditions. They can lead to experience of new mental health conditions, including PTSD, risky behavior like substance use. They're massively disruptive in terms of communities being evacuated or displaced, damage to homes, to infrastructure, and also having a really significant economic impact. And all of that will have a negative impact on mental health. And then there's these chronic effects of climate change, or sometimes thought of as slow-moving disasters. That includes rising sea levels, drought, the heat that soon-to-be Dr. Daly is speaking about. And these things can lead to food insecurity, malnutrition, migration, and displacement. Heat itself is associated with increased suicide rates and violence. And these impacts are not experienced equally by any means. Women, racialized populations, and people from low and middle income countries experience the disproportionate impact of climate change. Another dimension is ecological grief. And so this is grief from the loss of natural environment, species, and connections to place. And so this is a picture of an LNG facility in northern BC. This is not pathologic. This is a natural, legitimate, and appropriate response to ecological loss. And Indigenous people, it's maybe particularly impactful in terms of how it can impact identity, culture, and livelihood. So in the context of all this, and you may be feeling this right now, it's normal to experience a whole wide range of emotions, and these are appropriate and normal responses to tremendous loss and disruption to our world. And youth are particularly vulnerable. This is a recent study that high rates of worry, and this is impacting their daily life as well. So as I mentioned, this is not eco-distress, and any climate emotions that come up are not pathological. It's a normal reaction to adverse circumstances. And I like this quote, that it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And so this is my last slide, that it is possible that in the context of so much stress, it can become more than eco-distress. And so, if folks are having difficulty functioning in terms of ability to attend work, social relationships, or if you're experiencing overwhelming emotions that you're not able to manage, or finding that coping in ways that may be risky for your health, or having thoughts of harming yourself or others, or wanting to end your life, that really encourage folks to reach out. And we do have a new national suicide hotline as well, 988. And so climate change really is an unappreciated mental health emergency. And so I will leave it here. Thank you so much. And I'll hand it back to you, Emiko.
Thank you, Dr. Grimminck. Thank you so much. I think it's really important for us to be talking about the mental health impacts along with the physical health impacts, because I think that's not talked about as much as it should be. And I especially liked how you and all of our speakers really made the connection and emphasized how physical health exacerbates mental health and mental health exacerbates physical health. And so, yeah, just seeing that holistic picture is really important. And I just want to reiterate a huge thank you to you and our other two speakers as well. And I know we're at time, so I'm going to quickly end us off by showing some calls to action and next steps that you can take. If you feel riled up after being at this webinar and you feel like, I want to do something, what can I do? We have a few options for you. If you're feeling more on the intense side and maybe you want to get out there and be on the ground and, take some direct action, there is a website that we are going to put into the chat, which is a website, Dogwood BC. They are an organization where you can sign up to volunteer. They do really wonderful work. Another way that you can take some action is by becoming a signatory of the BC Climate Emergency Campaign. So if you belong to an organization or a group or anything, you are so welcome to sign on to our open letter. And from there, if you want to get even more involved, you are so welcome at any time. Meeting with your MLA is a bit of a bigger ask, but it's something that goes a really long way and is very important, because our MLAs and our cabinet ministers are the ones making decisions about these projects. And they keep telling us that they don't hear from people who are opposed. They're not hearing from their constituents about climate action. And so it's incredibly important for all of us to be meeting with them, calling them, emailing them, talking to them about climate change and telling them how important you believe climate action is. If you have never met with your MLA and you're like, I would like to do that, but I have no idea what to do, we are here to help you and would be so happy to meet with you and give you resources and help you every step of the way to do so. And really, I can't emphasize enough how important this is. So if you feel like challenging yourself and taking a risk and doing something you've never done before, please reach out and we can walk you through that. Finally, we have a few additional resources. Some of them have been shared in the chat already, but there is a fact sheet that we have put together which goes into even more detail about LNG. There is that podcast episode, and in fact, a few podcast episodes, which dive more deeply into LNG. One of them talks more about the PRGT pipeline in particular. The very last thing I will say is, if you do one thing after this webinar, please talk to people about the impacts of LNG, about natural gas in general. People don't realize that having a gas stove is harming their health. They don't realize that heating your home with gas is also harmful for your health. They don't realize that BC has become this fossil fuel powered superpower that is really going all in on honestly climate harming, health harming, polluting fossil fuel that is really damaging all aspects of our life. So spread the word, talk to your friends and family about this, talk to your MLA. And I just want to thank you all so much for taking the time. Apologies that we did go 5 minutes over, but almost everybody has stayed, which is wonderful. So thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you.